He swept the floors at 5 a.m. when no one was watching, who'd always up, never made eye contact. The Navy SEALs training there saw him as just another invisible worker. But when his hood slipped during a late-night cleaning shift, one young SEAL caught a glimpse of ink on his neck, a tattoo that made his blood run cold. Because that wasn't just any tattoo, that was a trident only one kind of man earns. Welcome to a man's war stories. Before we dive into this powerful tale of hidden identity and earned respect, tell me in the comments from which city are you watching this video today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These moments of recognition matter more than we know. The Naval Special Warfare Training Facility in Coronado operated on a schedule that most civilians couldn't comprehend. By 4:30 a.m., the lights were on. By 5 a.m., the first wave of trainees was already sweating through their morning PT. By 6 a.m., the sound of boots on concrete and instructors shouting commands echoed through the complex like a daily symphony of controlled chaos. And by 4:45 a.m., every morning without fail, Marcus Thompson was already there. Marcus was 52 years old, though the years had been harder on him than they should have been. He moved with the careful precision of someone whose body had been pushed beyond its limits and was now paying the price. His left knee clicked when he walked a souvenir from a parachute landing that had gone wrong in a place he couldn't name. His right shoulder sat slightly higher than his left, the result of carrying too much weight over too many miles in too many countries that didn't appear on tourist maps. But his hands were steady. That's what mattered in his current line of work. Marcus was the night janitor at the SEAL training facility. Though night was a relative term when your shift started at 4:45 a.m. and ended whenever the last trainee left the building. Sometimes that was 8 p.m. Sometimes it was midnight. Sometimes it was 2 a.m. when a class was running extended training exercises. Marcus never complained. He just cleaned. The job had found him 3 years ago during one of the darker periods of his life. He'd been living in a studio apartment in San Diego, surviving on disability payments, and the kind of silence that comes when you've seen too much and have no one to talk to about it. The VA counselor had suggested he find work something to give his days structure, something to make him feel useful again. You were military, she'd said, reviewing his file. Maybe something in that environment would be comfortable for you. She had no idea how right she was, or how wrong. The SEAL facility was both a sanctuary and a torture chamber for Marcus. Every day he watched young men push themselves to their absolute limits, watched them discover reserves of strength and determination they didn't know they possessed. It reminded him of who he used to be. It also reminded him of who he could never be again. The trainees barely noticed him. To them, he was just part of the background, the guy who mopped the floors, emptied the trash, and made sure their training environment was spotless. They were focused on their own journeys, their own struggles to earn the Trident. That would mark them as members of one of the world's most elite fighting forces. Marcus understood their focus. He'd had that same tunnel vision once, that same burning desire to prove himself worthy of something greater than himself. The difference was, Marcus had already proven it. His routine was simple and unchanging. Arrive at 4:45 a.m., unlock the building, turn on the lights, start with the locker rooms, mop the floors, clean the showers, restock the towels. Move to the main training areas, sweep, mop, sanitize the equipment, check the offices, empty the trash, vacuum the carpets. By the time the first trainees arrived, the facility would be pristine. During the day, he moved like a ghost through the building. He'd learned to anticipate the flow of training, to clean around the activities without disrupting them. When the trainees were in the pool, he'd work on the dry areas. When they were running obstacle courses outside, he'd focus on the indoor spaces. When they were in classrooms, he'd clean the gym. He wore the same uniform every day, dark blue work, pants, a gray hoodie, and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. The hood was always up when he was working, partly because the air conditioning made the building cold in the early morning hours, but mostly because it helped him stay invisible. Invisible was safe. Invisible meant no questions, no conversations, no risk of someone recognizing something in his eyes that might lead to uncomfortable questions about his past. The young SEALs in training were good men. Marcus could see that. They had the same qualities he'd once possessed: determination, courage, the willingness to sacrifice everything for something bigger than themselves. But they were also young, and youth came with a certain arrogance, a certain assumption that they were the first generation to face real challenges. Marcus had been young once, too. He remembered thinking that his war, his missions, his sacrifices were somehow more significant than those who had come before him. Time and experience had taught him that every generation of warriors thought they were the first to face the impossible. The truth was, the impossible had been faced by men like him for decades before these young trainees were even born. Marcus had earned his Trident in 1994, during an era when the SEALs were transitioning from Cold War operations to the new realities of global terrorism. He'd served for 16 years through multiple deployments, countless missions, and operations that would never appear in any official record. He'd been good at his job, very good, too good perhaps, the kind of good that led to assignments in places that didn't exist, working with people whose names were never written down, accomplishing objectives that were measured not in territory gained or enemies defeated, but in disasters prevented and lives saved. The kind of good that eventually broke something inside him that couldn't be fixed. His last mission had been in 2010, in a country he still couldn't name, pursuing a target whose identity remained classified. The mission had been successful by every measurable standard. The target was eliminated, the threat neutralized, the team extracted without casualties. But Marcus had seen something during that operations, something that made him realize he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. Not a moral line, exactly, but a psychological one. He'd become too comfortable with violence, too efficient at ending lives, too disconnected from the part of himself that remembered why he'd become a warrior in the first place. He'd requested a transfer to training duties. Then early retirement. Then medical discharge when the nightmares started, and the drinking began, and the walls of his apartment started feeling like a prison cell. The Trident tattoo on his neck had been done in 2001 after his third deployment. It was smaller than the ones most SEALs got, more subtle, positioned where it would normally be hidden by a collar or a shirt. But it was detailed in ways that only someone who'd earned the right to wear it would understand. The traditional Trident featured an eagle, an anchor, and a pistol. Marcus's version included additional elements, small numbers that corresponded to specific operations, tiny symbols that represented classified units, details that told the story of a career spent in the shadows. Most people who saw it would recognize it as military ink. Only someone who'd been in the community would understand what the additional details meant. Marcus had been careful to keep it hidden during his 3 years at the facility. The hoodie, the high collar, the way he positioned himself when he worked, designed to ensure that his past remained buried. But on this particular Tuesday night in October, everything changed. The training schedule had been disrupted by weather. A storm system had moved through Southern California, bringing heavy rain and winds that made outdoor training impossible. The instructors had adapted by extending the indoor sessions, pushing the trainees through additional PT, extra classroom time, and extended equipment maintenance. By 11 p.m., most of the trainees had finally been dismissed. By midnight, the building was supposed to be empty, except for Marcus and the overnight security guard. But Petty Officer Second Class Jake Morrison was still there. Morrison was 26 years old, 3 weeks into his SEAL training, and struggling. Not with the physical demands, he was strong enough, fast enough, tough enough to handle the punishment. His struggle was mental. He'd grown up in a small town in Ohio, the son of a factory worker and a school teacher, and he'd never been around the kind of casual violence and aggression that was part of SEAL culture. The other trainees sensed his uncertainty, and some of them had begun to target him during training exercises. Nothing overt, nothing that would get them in trouble with the instructors, but the kind of subtle harassment that was designed to break his confidence and make him quit. Morrison was determined not to quit, but he was also smart enough to know that he needed to find a way to prove himself to his classmates, to show them that he belonged in their ranks, so he'd stayed late, working on his equipment, reviewing his notes, trying to find some edge that would help him succeed. The building was quiet, the lights dimmed, and he thought he was alone. He was wrong. Marcus was in the main training area, mopping the floors with the methodical precision that had become second nature to him. He'd been working for 6 hours straight, and his body was starting to remind him of all the old injuries, all the accumulated damage from a career spent pushing physical limits. He was tired, more tired than usual, and when he bent over to wring out the mop, his hood slipped back. Morrison was walking through the training area, heading for the exit, when he saw the janitor working in the dim light. He'd seen the man hundreds of times over the past 3 weeks, but always from a distance, always with the hood up, always moving away from the trainees rather than toward them. But now, for the first time, Morrison could see his face, and more importantly, he could see his neck. The tattoo was small, maybe 2 inches across, positioned just below the hairline where it would normally be hidden by a collar. In the dim light, Morrison almost missed it. But something about the design caught his eye, made him look closer, and then his blood went cold. Morrison had grown up in a military family. His grandfather had been a Marine in Korea. His uncle had served in the Army during Desert Storm, and his older brother was currently deployed with the Air Force in Afghanistan. He'd been around military culture his entire life, had seen hundreds of military tattoos, had learned to read the stories they told, but he'd never seen anything like this. The basic design was a trident, the symbol of the Navy SEALs. But this wasn't the standard version that most SEALs wore. This was something else, something more complex, something that spoke of operations and achievements that went beyond normal SEAL duties. Morrison stopped walking. He stood in the shadows, watching the janitor work, trying to process what he was seeing. The man moved with a precision that Morrison recognized. It wasn't the careful movements of someone trying not to make noise. It was the controlled, efficient movement of someone who'd been trained to move that way, someone for whom situational awareness and tactical positioning had become instinctive. Morrison had seen that kind of movement before, in his instructors, in the senior SEALs who occasionally visited the training facility. It was the way operators moved even when they were doing something as mundane as mopping a floor. And then there was the tattoo. Morrison had been studying SEAL history and traditions since he'd decided to pursue this path. He knew about the different eras of SEAL operations, the evolution of tactics and equipment, the legendary figures who'd shaped the community. He'd seen photos of tattoos from different periods, different units, different types of operations. The tattoo on the janitor's neck included elements that Morrison had only seen in classified briefings, symbols that corresponded to operations that were still considered sensitive. Even decades after they'd been completed, this wasn't just a SEAL tattoo. This was the tattoo of someone who'd been involved in the kind of operations that didn't appear. In official histories, Morrison felt his heart racing. He knew he should leave, should pretend he hadn't seen anything, should maintain the invisible barrier that existed between the trainees and the support staff. But he also knew that he was looking at something extraordinary. He was looking at a piece of living history. A man who'd served at the highest levels of special operations and was now working as a janitor in the same facility, where the next generation was being trained. Morrison made a decision that would change both their lives. He stepped out of the shadows. "Excuse me," he said quietly. Marcus looked up, and for just a moment, Morrison saw something in his eyes that confirmed everything he'd suspected. It was the look of a man who'd been caught, who'd been recognized, who'd been hoping to remain invisible, but had just been seen for who he really was. "Sir," Morrison continued, his voice respectful but uncertain, "I'm sorry to bother you, but that tattoo on your neck, I couldn't help but notice." Marcus straightened slowly, his hand, instinctively, moving to pull his hood back up, but it was too late. The moment of recognition had already passed between them. "You're mistaken," Marcus said quietly. "It's just a tattoo." But Morrison had spent 3 weeks learning to read people, learning to detect deception, learning to see through the facades that people constructed to hide their true selves. And he could see that the janitor was lying. More than that, he could see that the janitor was afraid. "Sir," Morrison said, taking a step closer, "I know what I'm looking at. That's not just any trident. Those symbols, those numbers, ... I've seen them in briefings about historical operations." Marcus set down his mop and looked directly at Morrison for the first time. In the dim light of the training facility, the two men studied each other, the young trainee who was struggling to prove himself worthy of joining an elite community, and the older man who'd already proven himself but had lost his way back to civilian life. "What's your name, son?" Marcus asked. "Morrison, sir," Petty Officer Second Class Jake Morrison. Where are you from? Morrison, Ohio, sir. Small town called Millfield? Marcus nodded. What made you want to be a SEAL? Morrison was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. I wanted to serve something bigger than myself, sir. I wanted to be part of something that mattered. And how's that working out for you? Morrison's shoulders sagged slightly. Honestly, sir, I'm struggling, the other guys. They don't think I belong here, and sometimes I wonder if they're right. Marcus studied the young man's face, seeing something of himself in the uncertainty. The determination mixed with doubt, the desire to prove himself worthy of something he wasn't sure he could achieve. What do you think you saw on my neck, Morrison? Morrison took a deep breath. I think I saw the tattoo of someone who's already done what I'm trying to do. Someone who's already proven himself in ways that most people will never understand. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, he pulled his hood back down, fully exposing the tattoo. You're right, he said simply. Morrison stared at the ink, taking in the details he'd only glimpsed before. Up close, he could see that it was even more complex than he'd realized. The Trident was surrounded by symbols that told the story of a career spent in the most classified corners of military operations. How long? Morrison asked. 16 years active duty. Retired in 2010, and now Now I'm a janitor, Marcus finished. And before you ask why, let me save you the trouble. Sometimes the war follows you home. Sometimes the things you've done, the things you've seen, they make it hard to be around people who haven't seen them too. Sometimes the only peace you can find is in simple work, in being invisible, in taking care of things without anyone expecting you to be a hero. Morrison nodded slowly. But you were a hero. Marcus shook his head. Heroes are what people call you when they don't understand. What you actually did, I was a soldier. I did my job. Some of it was necessary. Some of it was ugly. All of it was classified. When it was over, I came home and tried to figure out how to be a civilian. This is what that looks like. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling between them. The other trainees, Morrison said finally, they don't know? No one knows. And I'd prefer to keep it that way. Why are you telling me? Marcus considered the question. Because you're struggling, and I remember what that feels like. Because you're questioning whether you belong here. And I can tell you that everyone questions that. Because you saw something you weren't supposed to see, and now we both have to decide what to do about it. Morrison looked around the empty training facility, at the equipment he'd been struggling to master, at the obstacles he'd been failing to overcome. What would you do? He asked. If you were me. Marcus picked up his mop and resumed cleaning, but his movements were different now, less mechanical, more thoughtful. I'd remember that everyone who's ever earned that Trident started exactly where you are now, he said, uncertain, scared, wondering if they're good enough. The difference between the ones who make it and the ones who don't isn't talent or strength, or natural ability. It's the willingness to keep going when everything inside you is telling you to quit. But what if I'm not cut out for this? What if the other guys are right? Marcus stopped mopping and looked directly at Morrison. Son, I've been watching you train for 3 weeks. You think I don't notice what goes on in this building? You think I don't see how the other trainees treat you, how you respond to the pressure, how you handle yourself when things get difficult? Morrison waited. You're not the strongest guy in your class, and you're not the fastest, but you're consistent. You show up every day, you do the work, you don't quit when things get hard. And more importantly, you treat people with respect. You don't participate in the bullying. You don't try to tear others down to build yourself up. That matters more than you know. But the instructors see everything I see, plus a lot more. If they didn't think you belonged here, you'd already be gone. The fact that you're still here means they believe in you. The question is whether you believe in yourself. Morrison was quiet for a moment, processing this. Can I ask you something? He said finally. Shoot. Do you ever regret it, the service, I mean? The things you had to do. Marcus leaned on his mop, considering the question. It was one he'd asked himself countless times. During the dark nights when sleep wouldn't come and the memories pressed in from all sides, I regret some of the things I had to do, he said finally. But I don't regret the service. I don't regret being part of something bigger than myself. I don't regret the men I served with, or the missions we completed, or the people we protected. What I regret is not finding a better way to come home from it all. Is that why you're here? Working as a janitor?" Marcus smiled, the first genuine smile Morrison had seen from him. "I'm here because this is where I can be useful without anyone expecting me to be something I'm not anymore. I keep this place clean so that the next generation of warriors can focus on becoming what they need to become. It's not glamorous, but it's honest work. And sometimes honest work is exactly what a man needs." Morrison nodded, understanding something he couldn't quite articulate. "Morrison," Marcus said, "can I give you some advice?" "Yes, sir. Stop trying to prove yourself to the other trainees. They're not the ones who decide whether you make it through this program. The instructors are, and the instructors are looking for men who can do the job, not men who can impress their classmates. But the team dynamics will sort themselves out. Right now, some of those guys are testing you, seeing if you'll break under pressure. Others are dealing with their own insecurities by targeting yours. But when the real training starts, when lives are on the line, they'll care more about whether you can do your job than whether you fit their idea of what a SEAL should look like." Morrison absorbed this. "And Morrison?" "Yes, sir. The fact that you stayed late tonight, that you're putting in extra work, that you're trying to improve yourself instead of just complaining about the situation, that tells me everything I need to know about your character. You're going to make it through this program, and when you do, you're going to be the kind of SEAL that other men will be proud to serve with." Morrison felt something shift inside him, a weight lifting that he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. "Thank you, sir, for telling me this, for trusting me with your story." Marcus pulled his hood back up, transforming himself once again into the invisible janitor who cleaned the floors and emptied the trash. "What story?" he said with a slight smile. "I'm just a janitor who works the night shift." Morrison understood. "Yes, sir. Just a janitor." But as Morrison walked toward the exit, he carried with him something more valuable than any training exercise or classroom lesson could have provided. He carried the knowledge that the man who cleaned the floors had once walked the same path. He was walking now, had faced the same doubts and fears and challenges, and had not only survived but excelled more than that. He carried the understanding that service took many forms, that heroism wasn't always visible, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with weapons, but with mops and patience and the quiet dignity of honest work. Over the following weeks, Morrison's performance in training improved dramatically. He stopped worrying about what the other trainees thought of him and focused on mastering the skills he needed to succeed. His confidence grew, his times improved, and gradually the harassment from his classmates diminished. He never spoke to Marcus again, not directly, but sometimes when he was struggling with a particularly difficult exercise or feeling overwhelmed by the demands of the program, he would catch sight of the janitor working quietly in the background, and he would remember their conversation. He would remember that everyone who'd ever earned the Trident had started exactly where he was. He would remember that the instructors saw more than he realized. He would remember that service took many forms, and that sometimes the most important thing a warrior could do was simply keep going when everything inside him was telling him to quit. Morrison graduated from SEAL training 6 months later. On his last day at the facility, he looked for Marcus, hoping to thank him one more time for the conversation that had changed his perspective and possibly saved his career. But Marcus was gone. The other janitors said he'd put in his notice 2 weeks earlier, said he was moving back east to be closer to family. Morrison never saw him again, but he never forgot the lesson he'd learned that night in the empty training facility, that heroes don't always wear uniforms, that wisdom often comes from unexpected sources, and that sometimes the most profound conversations happen between a struggling trainee and a janitor who turned out to be so much more than he appeared. When Morrison was leading his own teams on classified missions in distant countries, he would think about Marcus Thompson. He would wonder if the older man had found the peace he was looking for, if he'd managed to build a life that honored both his service and his humanity. And sometimes, when Morrison encountered young operators who were struggling with their own doubts and fears, he would remember the kindness that Marcus had shown him, and he would find ways to pass that same encouragement forward, because that's what warriors do for each other. They carry the lessons forward. They share the wisdom. They ensure that no one has to face the darkness alone. And sometimes, the most important battles are won not with violence, but with understanding, not with strength, but with compassion. not with weapons, but with words spoken at exactly the right moment by exactly the right person. Marcus Thompson had been the right person for Jake Morrison, and Jake Morrison would become the right person for countless others who would follow in his footsteps. The circle of service, of mentorship, of warriors taking care of warriors continued, just as it always had, just as it always would, in the quiet corners of the world where heroes worked as janitors and legends mopped floors. The most important work of all was being done, the work of ensuring that the next generation would be ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, and that work, invisible though it might be, was perhaps the most heroic work of all.